The sound of heavy cream-colored parchment sliding across a polished marble table is surprisingly loud. Or perhaps it was simply the suffocating silence between us that made it deafening. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of the Lunaria dining room, the Manhattan skyline glittered with an arrogant kind of beauty. The Empire State Building stood tall in the distance, bathed in golden lights, a silent witness to a dinner reservation that had been booked 6 months in advance. It was our first anniversary. The jazz band in the corner was playing a soft melodic tune, and the crystal chandeliers cast a warm romantic glow over the room. Everything was picture perfect. Everything was a lie. Sterling sat across from me, his posture impeccably straight in his charcoal Tom Ford suit. His expression was a flawless mask of indifference, the kind he usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. Even his scent, a commanding, crisp winter pine that usually made my omega instincts purr, was tightly suppressed, leaking only a faint, icy chill that made me shiver. "I want a divorce," Elias Sterling said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. There was no hesitation, no wavering of the eyes. He spoke as if he were canceling a magazine subscription, not ending a marriage. Underneath the table, my right hand was buried deep in the pocket of my cashmere coat. My thumb trembled slightly as it traced the smooth, glossy surface of a small photograph hidden inside. 3 weeks. That was what Dr. Miller had told me just hours ago. A tiny steady heartbeat was blooming inside me, a fragile secret I had planned to share tonight over dessert. I had spent hours imagining how the ice in Sterling's eyes might finally melt, how he might look at me as a family rather than a legal obligation. "It has been a year," Sterling continued, his tone clinical. "This arrangement isn't working. I don't feel the bond deepening, and I refuse to stay in a marriage out of mere duty. My lawyers have drawn up the papers. You will be compensated generously, of course." The words hovered in the air, meaningless sounds that refused to form sense. Arrangement. Is that what my absolute devotion had been to him? I looked at the divorce papers. They were already signed. His signature was sharp, aggressive, and utterly final. My chest tightened, a phantom pain ripping through the invisible thread that connected my soul to his. My omega instinct screamed in terror, urging me to submit, to release distressed pheromones, to beg my alpha not to abandon our unborn child. But I didn't. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, forcing the tears back down my throat. I would not give him the satisfaction of my breakdown. I would not use my child as a bargaining chip to trap a man who clearly viewed me as a failed investment. "I see," I managed to say. My voice was a fragile whisper, but it didn't break. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen resting beside the folder. The metal felt freezing against my skin. With a steady hand that surprised even me, I signed my name beneath his. Each stroke felt like carving a piece of my own heart out of my chest. But the moment the pen lifted from the paper, a strange hollow clarity washed over me. "Happy anniversary, Sterling," I said softly, sliding the folder back to him. His jaw tightened. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his dark eyes, confusion perhaps, or a fleeting shadow of guilt. But he quickly masked it, gathering the papers with efficient, businesslike movements. He stood up without another word. I walked out of the restaurant alone, leaving him behind in the golden glow of the chandeliers. The rain greeted me as I stepped onto the New York streets. The cab ride back to the Upper East Side penthouse was a blur of neon lights and wet asphalt. When I unlocked the door, the sheer scale of the empty, luxurious apartment mocked me. The air smelled entirely of him, a scent that suddenly triggered a violent wave of nausea. I barely made it to the marble sink before losing my empty stomach, gripping the edges until my knuckles turned white. I am pregnant, divorced, and completely alone. The reality crashed into me, heavy and suffocating. But as I wiped my mouth and looked at my pale reflection in the mirror, the fear began to calcify into something else, something harder. I walked into the bedroom and packed exactly one suitcase. I took only the clothes I had bought with my own money from my previous freelance gigs. I left behind the designer watches, the diamond cufflinks, the tailored suits he had gifted me to make me look the part of a billionaire's trophy Omega. I was ready to walk out the door when my eyes landed on the entryway console. Sitting there right next to a silver key tray was a matte black American Express Centurion card. I stared at it. I remembered the night of our wedding when he had carelessly tossed it onto my lap before leaving for a crucial business trip in Tokyo. "Use it. Buy whatever you want, just don't bother me," he had said. I had never touched it once in the past year, too proud to be his kept pet. But looking at it now, a cold calculating resolve settled over my shattered heart. Sterling had discarded me. He had thrown me away without a second thought, completely unaware of the life growing inside me. He thought he could just erase me with a signature. I reached out and picked up the black card. The metal was heavy and cold, practically vibrating with limitless financial power. A feral protective instinct flared in my chest. If my alpha wouldn't protect us, I would build an empire to do it myself. And I would use his empire to fund it. Call it alimony, call it a severance package. I called it seed funding. I slipped the card into my wallet, the metal cold and heavy against my fingers. 4 hours later, I was seated in the first-class cabin of a red-eye flight from JFK to San Francisco, destined for the quiet coastal anonymity of Carmel by the Sea. The flight attendant handed me a glass of sparkling water with a polite smile. I took a sip, looking out the window as the glittering, merciless grid of New York City faded into the dark clouds below. I rested my left hand gently over my flat stomach. "Don't worry, little one," I whispered into the quiet hum of the jet engine. "We are going to be just fine. Be sure to thank your father for his extremely generous angel investment." Carmel by the Sea was everything Manhattan was not. There were no towering glass skyscrapers reflecting relentless ambition, no deafening sirens tearing through the night, and most importantly, there was no scent of crisp winter pine. Here, the air smelled only of ancient cedar-damp earth and the raw, unforgiving salt of the Pacific Ocean. I rented a secluded wooden cabin that clung stubbornly to the edge of a rocky cliff. Every morning, the fog rolled in thick and white from the sea, wrapping the house in a soft, impenetrable blanket. It was the perfect place to disappear. It was the perfect place to rebuild. The first few weeks were a physical blur. My body was rapidly changing, adjusting to the terrifying, miraculous demands of the life growing inside me. Morning sickness hit me with brutal precision every day at dawn. I would lean over the cold porcelain sink, shivering in my oversized sweater, breathing through the nausea until my vision cleared. But I never allowed myself to stay in bed. I had work to do, and I had a war to fund. The living room of the cozy coastal cabin no longer looked like a retreat. It looked like the control center of a rogue tech startup. Towering stacks of matte black boxes lined the wooden walls, high-capacity servers, professional rendering workstations, sophisticated lighting rigs, and a ridiculously expensive cinema-grade camera. Sitting in the absolute center of the oak dining table, right beside my bottle of prenatal vitamins, was Sterling's black Centurion card. I had swiped it without a single ounce of hesitation. Before our marriage, before I was reduced to a beautiful ornament for his gala dinners, I had been a brilliant data analyst. I was a strategist who understood the intricate web of consumer behavior better than the executives twice my age. But Sterling had preferred his Omega quiet compliant and out of the boardroom. I had buried my ambitions deep into the earth to fit into the polished mold of his world. Now I was buying them back, using his limitless credit line. I spent 3 grueling weeks filming, editing, and perfecting my first piece of content. It was a sophisticated, high-quality deep dive into digital market trends and consumer psychology cleverly disguised as an aesthetic lifestyle video. The lighting was cinematic, the audio was flawlessly crisp, and the analytical content was razor-sharp. With a deep breath and a hand resting protectively over my slightly rounded stomach, I clicked publish on the newly created channel. I leaned back in my chair. I waited. I expected a slow trickle of views, perhaps a few curious clicks from the algorithm's initial push. I left the laptop open on the table and went to the kitchen to steep a cup of ginger tea to settle my rolling stomach. When I returned an hour later, I refreshed the page. 0 views. I frowned, tracing the rim of my mug. I waited another hour. I refreshed again. 0 views. By midnight, the glowing screen still mocked me with a single devastating digit 1 view, and I knew with bitter certainty that it was just me checking to see if the link was somehow broken. The silence of the algorithm was deafening. It felt eerily, agonizingly similar to the silence in that Manhattan restaurant. A cold, heavy weight settled in my chest, making it hard to breathe. Doubt toxic and fiercely familiar began to whisper in my ear. Sterling was right, the voice hissed in the dark. You are nothing without his name attached to yours. You are just a discarded pregnant Omega playing pretend on the edge of a cliff. I closed my eyes, tears of sheer frustration burning violently behind my eyelids. I was exhausted entirely, at the mercy of my fluctuating hormones, and utterly terrified. I buried my face in my trembling hands, a choked, pathetic sob escaping my throat. Was this a massive mistake? Was I completely delusional to think I could build an empire from a wooden cabin with nothing but a credit card and a broken heart? The sharp clinical sound of an incoming email cut through the quiet room. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve and dragged the mouse over to the notification icon. It was forwarded from David Sterling's executive assistant. My stomach immediately tied itself into a suffocating knot. It was a fraud alert override from American Express, clearing the massive six-figure transactions I had made over the past month. But at the bottom of the sterile banking text, David had taken the liberty of adding a personal, sickeningly polite note. "Good evening, Mr. Elias. Mr. Sterling was notified of the recent high-limit transactions by the bank's fraud department. He has personally authorized them to approve all charges without interruption. He hopes the retail therapy in California brings you some comfort and relaxation during this transitional period. Please let me know if you need assistance shipping any of your designer purchases back to New York. Best regards, David. Retail therapy. Designer purchases." I stared at the glowing screen. I slowly turned my head to look at the towering server racks humming quietly in the corner, the intricate hand-drawn diagrams of data infrastructure I had taped across the windows, and the high-performance rendering computers that cost more than most sports cars. He thinks I am buying Birkin bags. He genuinely thought I was wandering around luxury boutiques, swiping his black card to soothe a broken heart like a walking cliché. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of it. The absolute blind condescension. A sharp, breathless laugh escaped my lips. It echoed loudly in the empty cabin. The tears in my eyes dried almost instantly, evaporating under a sudden wave of cold, burning clarity. "Let them think we are shopping," I whispered to the quiet room, my hand dropping to caress the firm curve of my stomach. "Let them think we are weak and crying over window displays." I didn't cry anymore. I opened my YouTube studio dashboard. I stopped looking at my video as a precious piece of art and started looking at it as a puzzle that needed to be cracked. The algorithm wasn't a cruel alpha who could judge my worth. It was a machine, and machines had rules. Machines had logic. I spent the next 48 hours completely submerged in a sea of data. I barely slept. I survived on crackers and sheer spite. I analyzed click-through rates, audience retention graphs, search engine optimization, and thumbnail psychology. I realized my fatal mistake. My content was brilliant, but my packaging was entirely invisible. I was speaking a nuanced language the machine hadn't been programmed to prioritize. I ruthlessly re-edited the video. I changed the pacing to hook the viewer in the first 3 seconds, designed a provocative high-contrast thumbnail, and weaponized the metadata with highly searched keywords. I didn't just upload a video this time. I engineered a digital virus designed to infect the platform. I clicked publish on the second attempt. I didn't wait around to watch the numbers. I closed the laptop, walked into the bedroom, and slept for a solid dreamless 10 hours. When I woke up the next morning, the California sun was streaming brightly through the salt-stained windows. I brewed my tea, sat at the desk, and opened the dashboard. The screen didn't show 0. The real-time analytics graph looked like a mountain peak piercing the sky. 50,000 views, 120,000 views. The counter was spinning so fast it blurred before my eyes. Thousands of comments were flooding in, praising the sharp analysis and unique presentation. Advertisers were already sending automated inquiries to the business email I had set up. I leaned back in the heavy chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. The fractured bond in my chest, the one that still ached faintly for an alpha who had thrown me away, finally quieted down. I had found a new heartbeat to listen to. The algorithm was awake, and my empire had just laid its very first stone. By the time the Californian autumn bled into a crisp, biting winter, my body had changed in ways I could no longer hide beneath oversized cashmere sweaters. The bump was now pronounced a solid, heavy curve that carried the undeniable stubborn weight of an alpha's air. I moved a little slower, my center of gravity shifting awkwardly. But as my physical body grew heavier and more grounded, my digital empire grew infinitely more lethal. The wooden cabin on the cliff was no longer enough. I had moved my operations into a sleek, minimalist office space in downtown Monterey, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the vast, restless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. I was no longer just a solo creator trying to crack a video algorithm. I was the founder and CEO of Onyx Media, a data-driven marketing and analytics firm that was quietly, ruthlessly tearing through the industry. But to the public, and more importantly to our competitors, I did not exist. I operated entirely behind the scenes, a ghost in the machine. I communicated with clients through encrypted emails and used AI-generated voice modulators for mandatory conference calls. My fiercely loyal director of operations, a brilliant beta named Sarah, handled all physical meetings. She thought I was simply a reclusive tech genius who preferred lines of code to human interaction. She didn't know I was a pregnant Omega using my ex-husband's limitless credit card to fund a corporate war against him. And a war it was. I didn't just want Onyx Media to succeed. I wanted to dismantle the market share Sterling Corporation had spent a decade building. It was never about petty revenge. It was about clinical surgical precision. Whenever Sterling's media division launched a massive multi-million-dollar traditional ad campaign for a Silicon Valley tech giant or a luxury conglomerate, Onyx would strike. While Sterling relied on outdated prestige and broad-spectrum marketing, I relied on raw, hyper-targeted data. I analyzed microtrends, predicted consumer behavioral shifts before they happened, and launched counter-campaigns that cost a fraction of Sterling's budget, but yielded triple the engagement. We bled their metrics dry. Within weeks, we poached 3 of their top-tier clients. The industry was buzzing about the mysterious Onyx Media, the aggressive startup that was making the Goliath of New York look embarrassingly slow and out of touch. But while I was winning the digital war, a much quieter, darker battle was waging inside my own biology. An alpha and omega bond, even a fractured, legally severed one, is a living, breathing entity. It defies divorce papers and ignores geographical distance. As my pregnancy progressed, my omega instincts craved the scent and presence of my child's father. I fought it with a brutal ironclad willpower, but at night, when the office lights were off and the ocean roared outside my window, the bond would flare. It wasn't just my pain I felt, it was his. Across the country, Sterling was unraveling. The bond transmitted a dull, restless static to my chest, a phantom pull of profound distress. I would see him occasionally on my monitors. A cover feature for the Wall Street Journal, a brief interview on Bloomberg. The headlines praised his stoic business tactics, but my eyes saw the truth the high-definition cameras tried to hide. Sterling looked immaculate in his Tom Ford suits, but his dark eyes were hollow-shadowed by a bone-deep exhaustion. His jaw was locked in a perpetual state of tension. He was an alpha operating without his omega, his biology violently rejecting the separation. The pheromone suppressants he was likely inhaling like oxygen were failing him. The bond whispered his insomnia to me, a desperate unconscious tug seeking an anchor he had willingly thrown away. Sometimes in the dead of night, the ghost of his voice would brush against my mind, murmuring my name in a tone so broken it made my breath hitch. Whenever that happened, I would place a hand over my belly, feeling our son kick vigorously against my palm, and I would reinforce the mental wall between us. You chose the silence, I reminded him quietly, in the dark. Now you must learn to live in it. The breaking point arrived in the second week of December. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing the quarterly analytics when Sarah knocked and entered. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a silver tablet. "Elias," she said, her voice breathy with disbelief. "We just received a direct communication from the executive board of Sterling Corporation." I didn't look up from my monitors. "Let me guess. A cease and desist." No, Sarah swallowed hard. "A buyout offer." She placed the tablet on my desk. I scanned the formal, sterile text. Sterling's pride had finally broken under the weight of his company's plummeting metrics. He couldn't beat Onyx, so he was trying to swallow it whole. The number at the bottom of the screen was astronomical, a 9-figure sum, meant to blind a startup into immediate submission. But there was a single non-negotiable clause attached to the billions. The acquisition will only be finalized upon a mandatory in-person negotiation. The founder and CEO of Onyx Media must be present at Sterling Corporation headquarters in Manhattan. The alpha was demanding to see the face of the ghost who was ruining him. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. My hand drifted to the black Centurion card resting right beside my keyboard, the very card he had given me to keep me quiet, which had just funded the empire that brought him to his knees. A slow, chilling smile touched my lips sharp enough to cut glass. "Sarah," I said, my voice dangerously calm as I looked out at the rolling waves of the Pacific. "Book a first-class ticket to New York. Tell Mr. Sterling the CEO of Onyx Media accepts his invitation." The elevator ride to the top floor of Sterling Corporation headquarters took exactly 42 seconds. I knew this because I used to count them. Back then, those 42 seconds were filled with the suffocating, fluttering anxiety of a dutiful Omega preparing to face a husband who barely had the time to look at him. Today, I didn't count the seconds. I watched the digital display tick upwards, feeling nothing but the rhythmic, steady heartbeat of my child beneath the fine charcoal wool of my bespoke three-piece suit. New York City was currently in the unforgiving grip of a bitter December, but inside the glass monolith of Sterling Corp, the climate was artificially, flawlessly perfect. As the elevator doors slid silently open, my director of operations, Sarah, shot me a nervous glance. She still didn't know the full truth. She only knew that our startup Onyx Media was about to face the most ruthless corporate predator in Manhattan. "Stay out here, Sarah," I instructed softly, adjusting the cuffs of my crisp white shirt. "I will handle this negotiation alone." I didn't wait for her protest. I turned the corner, my leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished marble floor, and pushed open the heavy double doors of the executive boardroom. The room was vast, dominated by a massive obsidian table that stretched beneath a custom-designed geometric chandelier. At the far end, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray, sprawling grid of the city, sat Sterling. He was leaning back in his high-backed leather chair, tapping a platinum pen against a thick stack of printed analytics. It was the posture of a king waiting to accept the unconditional surrender of a rebellious province. He didn't even bother to look up as I entered, his dark gaze fixed intently on the papers. "You are 3 minutes late," Sterling said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that sent a ghost of a shiver down my spine. I assumed the CEO of Onyx Media would possess better time management skills considering your aggressively efficient data strategies. I didn't reply. I walked slowly across the thick, sound-absorbing carpet. With every step, the distance between us closed, and the heavy, suppressed silence of the room began to fracture. "Well," Sterling finally snapped, dropping the pen and looking up, his patience evaporating. "Are you going to sit?" The words died violently in his throat. It was as if the air had been entirely sucked out of the room. Sterling froze, his dark eyes widening in a visceral, paralyzing shock. His gaze snapped from my face, darted down to the undeniable 5-month swell of my stomach, pressing against the tailored vest, and snapped back up to my face. The platinum pen slipped from the edge of the table and clattered loudly onto the hardwood floor. For the entire duration of our 1-year marriage, whenever I was in his presence, I had religiously taken chemical suppressants. Sterling had always preferred a clean corporate environment, claiming that omega pheromones distracted him from his work and clouded logic. But today, I had taken absolutely nothing. As I reached the opposite end of the obsidian table, I stopped, locked my eyes with his, and let my absolute unfiltered scent bloom into the sterile room. It was no longer the soft, submissive fragrance of a compliant spouse trying to please his alpha. It was deep, territorial, and overwhelmingly protective, the fierce, unmistakable scent of an omega carrying an alpha's air. It hit the air of the boardroom like a tidal wave of pure biology. Sterling's breath hitched audibly. His alpha instinct, starved, fractured, and frayed from months of a severed bond, slammed into his consciousness with the force of a freight train. I watched his knuckles turn bone white as he gripped the armrests of his chair, his body physically locked down under the biological weight of my presence. He couldn't move. He was completely, utterly paralyzed by his own nature. "Hello, Sterling," I said, my voice smooth, cold, and perfectly level. I didn't sit down. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the 9-figure buyout contract his legal team had confidently sent me. I tossed it onto the dark glass of the table. It slid across the smooth surface, stopping just inches from his frozen hands. "Elias." His voice was a broken, hoarse whisper, entirely stripped of its usual arrogance. His eyes remained fixed on my stomach, sheer disbelief warring with a sudden, devastating realization. You are the CEO of Onyx Media. I finished for him, entirely ignoring his unasked question. I reached into the briefcase one last time. I pulled out a thick-bound ledger of financial statements and set it down right next to the rejected contract. Sitting perfectly on top of the financial documents, gleaming under the chandelier, was the matte black American Express Centurion card. Sterling's eyes shifted to the card, and I saw the exact excruciating moment his brilliant analytical mind finally connected the pieces. The massive server purchases he had dismissed as retail therapy, the exorbitant advertising expenditures, the sudden explosive rise of the anonymous startup that had been systematically dismantling his empire for the past 5 months. Sterling choked out the color completely draining from his face, leaving him looking ashen and hollow. The capital, the seed funding, was very generous. Yes, I smiled, though the expression was entirely devoid of warmth. Your credit limit is truly spectacular, Sterling. I used it to build a better algorithm, hire a smarter team, and systematically bleed your market share dry. He stared at me, his chest heaving, trapped between the agony of a wounded alpha and the absolute humiliation of a defeated CEO. Why, he whispered, his dark eyes shining with something that looked terrifyingly like tears. Because a year ago, at Lunaria Terrace, you told me I was a bad investment. I replied quietly, the memory no longer hurting, only fueling the ice in my veins. You said I was failing to yield returns in our marriage, so I decided to pivot my strategy. I took your money and I built an empire that doesn't require my submission to exist. I tapped my index finger against the black card once. Onyx Media is not for sale, Sterling. Neither am I. As for the startup capital, my finance department has structured a repayment plan. You will be fully reimbursed for the credit card charges by the end of the fiscal year with standard banking interest. Sterling tried to stand his hand, reaching out across the vast table. His alpha pheromones finally leaked through his shock in a desperate pleading wave of distress, wrapping around my senses and begging for comfort. Elias, wait. Please? The baby. I didn't know. Please. This meeting is concluded, I stated coldly, turning my back on him. I walked out of the boardroom with the same measured, steady pace I had used to walk in. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The deafening, shattered silence I left behind was all the confirmation I needed. The alpha who had thrown me away had just realized he had funded his own ruin, and for the very first time in his privileged life, all the money in the world couldn't buy back what he had lost. Leaving New York was easier than I had anticipated. Leaving Sterling completely paralyzed in his own glass fortress, surrounded by the undeniable empirical proof of his own hubris, was a masterpiece I replayed in my mind during the entire flight back to the West Coast. By the time I returned to Monterey, my pregnancy had entered the 7th month. The physical toll was becoming impossible to ignore. My ankles swelled by mid-afternoon, my lower back constantly ached with a dull, throbbing pressure, and my lungs felt perpetually compressed by the sheer stubborn size of the alpha child growing inside me. Yet despite the physical exhaustion, my mind had never been sharper. Onyx Media was no longer just a startup. It was an apex predator in the digital space, and I was holding its reins with absolute, uncompromising control. I fully expected Sterling to unleash a legal bloodbath. I expected him to use his army of corporate lawyers to freeze my assets, or perhaps attempt to challenge me in family court. But Sterling did none of those things. He didn't call. He didn't send emails. He knew I had blocked his private numbers and rerouted his corporate addresses straight to the spam folder. He knew that any traditional attempt to contact me would be met with absolute deafening silence. So, the brilliant, ruthless CEO of Sterling Corporation decided to speak to me in the only language I still respected, data. It started on a gloomy Tuesday morning. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, sipping a cup of decaf herbal tea, looking out at the city. Directly across the street from my building was a massive high-definition digital billboard that usually cycled through luxury car commercials and designer perfumes. Suddenly, the screen glitched. The vibrant colors vanished, replaced by a stark matte black background. A sleek, glowing white line graph materialized on the screen, accompanied by minimalist, incredibly familiar corporate typography. I narrowed my eyes, stepping closer to the glass. Target audience, E-row. Metric 1. Absolute regret rate, 100%. Upward trend. No plateau in sight. Metric 2. Probability of alpha survival, without omega 0.001%. Metric 3. Love index infinite. Projected timeline for forgiveness, willing to wait indefinitely. I nearly choked on my tea. The office door behind me clicked open and Sarah, my director of operations, rushed in. She was clutching her tablet, her eyes wide with bewilderment. "Elias, are you seeing this? It is not just the billboard across the street. We are getting reports that every major LED screen in a 5-mile radius of this office and 3 massive screens in Times Square back in New York are broadcasting the exact same analytics. Is this some kind of aggressive guerrilla marketing campaign by a competitor?" I stared at the glowing white graph on the black screen. The sheer audacity of it. The ridiculous, exorbitant waste of capital. He wasn't sending me pathetic bouquets of roses or handwritten letters of apology. He was weaponizing millions of dollars in advertising real estate to publicly mathematically beg for my forgiveness. "No, Sarah," I said, a dry, incredulous laugh escaping my lips despite my best efforts to suppress it. "It is not a marketing campaign. It is a white flag." I ordered Sarah to ignore the billboards. I refused to acknowledge them. Let him burn his cash. Let him sit in the agonizing silence he had subjected me to for an entire year. I wanted him to taste the bitter, suffocating feeling of not being seen, of screaming into a void and receiving absolutely nothing in return. But Sterling wasn't just in New York anymore. A few days later, a sleek, blacked-out SUV parked across the street from the Onyx Media Building. It didn't move. It stayed there through the morning fog, the afternoon rain, and the freezing coastal nights. Sterling never stepped out of the vehicle to accost me. He never tried to force his way past the lobby security. He simply existed on the periphery of my world, a silent, unwavering sentinel. And as much as I hated to admit it, my biology betrayed my pride. The moment Sterling came within a 1-mile radius of me, the agonizing phantom ache in my chest instantly vanished. The fractured bond, which had been bleeding a low-frequency distress signal for months, suddenly hummed with a deep, resonating warmth. My erratic sleep schedule stabilized. The baby, who usually kicked with a violent, restless energy at night, settled into a calm, contented rhythm. The sheer proximity of the alpha's pheromones, even filtered through distance and glass, acted as a biological balm for my exhausted omega system. I hated that my body needed him, so I punished us both by working harder. The climax of my stubbornness arrived in the middle of my 8th month. It was past 11 at night on a Friday. The office was completely empty, the servers humming a low, mechanical lullaby. I was sitting at my desk, obsessively analyzing a massive, convoluted dataset for an upcoming political campaign. I was exhausted, my vision blurring at the edges, but I refused to go home to the empty cabin. Suddenly, a sharp, tearing pain ripped through my lower abdomen. It wasn't the dull ache of an expanding uterus. It was a violent, paralyzing cramp that stole the oxygen straight out from my lungs. I gasped, my hands flying to my stomach as a wave of cold sweat broke across my forehead. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out completely. I collapsed back into the leather chair, my elbow knocking my ceramic mug off the desk. It hit the hardwood floor, shattering into a dozen jagged pieces. A whimper tore from my throat, raw and terrified. I clutched my heavy belly, feeling the muscle wall seize in a terrifying, unnatural contraction. It is too early. It is far too early. The bond inside my chest didn't just hum, it screamed. It flared with a blinding, desperate panic that wasn't entirely my own. I fumbled blindly for my phone on the desk, my fingers trembling so violently I couldn't unlock the screen. Another wave of pain hit darker and heavier than the last. I closed my eyes, a single tear slipping down my cheek as I curled inward, trying to protect the life inside me. A loud crash echoed as the heavy double doors of my office were practically ripped off their hinges. I didn't even have to open my eyes to know who it was. The scent hit me first, an overwhelming, suffocating tsunami of crisp winter pine, laced with the sharp, acidic tang of absolute primal terror. Sterling was across the room in 3 massive strides. He looked nothing like the immaculate, untouchable billionaire from Manhattan. His tie was gone, his shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and his hair was a messy, wind-blown disaster. His eyes were wide, dark, and completely unhinged. Elias. He dropped to his knees right into the shattered ceramic on the floor, not even flinching as the shards bit into his suit pants. His large, shaking hands immediately framed my face, his thumbs wiping away the cold sweat on my cheeks. "I am here. I am right here. Look at me. It hurts. I sobbed, the ironclad walls of my pride instantly crumbling under the sheer, terrifying reality of the moment. Sterling the baby, it is too early. I have got you. I have got you both, he rumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears. He didn't hesitate. He stripped off his heavy wool overcoat and wrapped it tightly around my trembling shoulders, drowning me in his concentrated scent. My omega instincts, desperate for salvation, violently latched onto his pheromones. The soothing, protective aura of the alpha washed over my seizing muscles, forcing the panic to recede, just enough for me to draw a shallow breath. Sterling slid one arm under my knees and the other around my back, lifting my heavy, pregnant frame as easily as if I weighed nothing at all. He held me tightly against his broad chest, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ear. "Hold on to me," he whispered fiercely, pressing his lips to my damp temple as he carried me out of the dark office. "I will never let you go again. I swear it." I buried my face into the crook of his neck, my fingers weakly gripping the lapels of his shirt. For the first time in over a year, I didn't push him away. I closed my eyes entirely, surrendering to the cold winter pine, and let the alpha carry us into the night. The back of the blacked-out SUV felt like a pressurized capsule suspended outside of time. Outside the tinted windows, the coastal highway was a blur of rain and flashing streetlights, but inside the only reality was the excruciating rhythmic tearing in my lower abdomen. I was curled entirely into Sterling's lap. His large, trembling arms were wrapped around my heavy frame, anchoring me to the leather seat as my body tried to rip itself apart. Every time a contraction hit, I buried my face into the crook of his neck, my fingers desperately twisting into the expensive fabric of his ruined shirt. "Breathe, Elias. Just breathe," Sterling murmured frantically, his lips pressed to my damp hair. His voice, usually a weapon of absolute corporate authority, was entirely unraveled. "Drive faster," he roared at his chauffeur, the raw panic in his tone echoing the frantic pulse of the bond in my chest. "I am trying, sir. The roads are slick. I don't care if you have to drive through a building. Get him to the hospital." A weak, breathless laugh escaped my lips before it morphed into a sharp groan of agony. Even now he was trying to throw his weight around, but the sheer, unapologetic desperation in his voice was the only thing keeping me from slipping into the dark abyss of the pain. When we finally crashed through the emergency doors of the Monterey Medical Center, the sterile, blinding lights of the hospital felt like a physical assault. A swarm of nurses and doctors descended upon us, pulling me onto a gurney. "He is 34 weeks, Sterling barked at the attending physician, refusing to let go of my hand as they rushed me down the linoleum hallway. "He has been under immense stress. Do whatever you have to do. Use whatever resources you need. If you need a specialist, I will fly them in right now. Just keep him safe. Sir, you need to step back." A nurse began, intimidated by the towering, frantic alpha. "Let him stay." I gasped out, my voice ragged. I squeezed Sterling's hand with whatever strength I had left. The thought of facing this blinding agony alone in a sterile room terrified me more than I wanted to admit. The delivery room was a chaotic blur of blue scrubs, sharp medical terminology, and the relentless rhythmic beeping of the fetal monitor. But the only thing that truly grounded me was the overwhelming, steadying scent of winter pine. Sterling didn't pace the room like an anxious executive waiting for a quarterly report. He didn't stand in the corner. He dropped to his knees right beside the hospital bed, completely ignoring the nurses rushing past him. He pressed his face against my damp temple, his broad shoulders shielding me from the terrifying reality of the room. He released his pheromones, intentionally now. It wasn't the aggressive, territorial scent he used to dominate boardrooms. It was pure, unadulterated submission. It was an alpha stripping away every single ounce of his pride, his ego, and his status to become nothing but a biological shield for his omega. The scent washed over me like a heavy, protective blanket, dulling the sharp edges of the panic and giving my exhausted muscles the strength to endure. "I am sorry," Sterling whispered into my skin between my ragged breaths. The tears he had been holding back finally slipped free, soaking into the collar of my hospital gown. "I am so incredibly sorry I wasn't there for the beginning of this. I am sorry I let you carry this weight, this fear, completely alone. Stop talking." I choked out, my nails digging violently into his broad shoulder as another massive contraction hit. "Just don't leave. Never. I swear to God, Elias, never again. I am right here." The labor stretched for what felt like agonizing hours. My entire world narrowed down to the blinding pain, the harsh fluorescent lights, and the dark, pleading eyes of the man kneeling beside me. I had built an empire by myself. I had conquered algorithms and dismantled corporate giants entirely on my own. But in this room, stripped of my data and my pride, I finally admitted that I didn't want to be alone anymore. "Okay, Elias, this is it," the doctor announced, her voice cutting through the haze. "On the next contraction, I need you to give me everything you have. Push!" I screamed, a raw, unfiltered sound that tore through my throat. I squeezed Sterling's hand so hard I felt his bones shift, but he didn't even flinch. He just poured every ounce of his strength into the bond holding me tethered to the earth as I gave the final agonizing push. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, and then a sound shattered the heavy tension. It was a sharp, furious, beautiful cry. The tension left my body in a sudden, violent rush. I collapsed back against the pillows, gasping for air, my vision swimming with exhausted tears. The frantic beeping of the monitors slowed. "It is a boy." The doctor smiled quickly, wrapping the tiny red-faced infant in a warm blanket before placing him gently onto my chest. "He is a bit early, but his lungs are incredibly strong." He was small, perfectly formed, and screaming with the sheer stubborn lungs of an alpha. The moment his warm, fragile weight settled against my skin, my heart shattered into a million pieces and instantly reformed around him. A faint, sweet scent of warm milk and cedar drifted from him, mixing perfectly with the winter pine in the room. I looked down at Sterling. He hadn't stood up. He was still on his knees, his massive hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the bedrail. He didn't look at the baby first. His dark, tear-filled eyes were fixed entirely on me, searching my pale face for any sign of distress. "You did it." Sterling choked out his voice, completely wrecked. "Elias, you did it. You are safe." "Look at him, Sterling," I whispered gently, running a trembling finger over the baby's dark, damp hair. "He is beautiful." Sterling finally shifted his gaze. He reached out slowly, as if approaching something incredibly fragile and sacred. A single trembling finger brushed against the baby's tiny, clenched fist. The infant immediately stopped crying, his tiny fingers unfurling to weakly grasp the edge of Sterling's thumb. Sterling let out a wet, broken sob. He bowed his head, resting his forehead gently against the back of my hand. "I have no right to ask you for anything," Sterling said, his voice raw, completely stripped of the billionaire facade he had worn for the past decade. "I lost the right to be your husband the day I walked out of that restaurant, but please, let me stay. I don't need a title. I don't need the marriage certificate. Just let me be a lifelong probationary employee in this family. Let me spend the rest of my life making this right." I looked at the powerful man kneeling before me in a ruined suit. The man I had fought, the man who had unknowingly funded my empire, the man who was currently weeping openly over our newborn son. The iron walls I had built around my heart finally irrevocably cracked, not from a violent siege, but from the quiet, persistent erosion of his absolute surrender. I took a deep, exhausted breath, a weak, genuine smile finally touching my lips. "The probationary period," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion, "is 50 years. If you miss a single milestone, you are fired without severance." Sterling let out a breathless, tearful laugh, pressing a reverent kiss to my knuckles, and then to the crown of our son's head. "Understood, Mr. CEO. I will never let you down." 6 months later, the California coast was bathed in the soft golden light of early summer. The relentless winter storms that had mirrored the chaos of my life were gone, replaced by a gentle, enduring breeze that carried the scent of ancient cedar and the Pacific Ocean. I was sitting on the expansive wooden deck of our Carmel-by-the-Sea home. No longer a solitary cabin, but a beautifully renovated coastal retreat. A mug of warm, decaffeinated Earl Grey tea rested in my hands. The air was entirely peaceful, save for the rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs below and the faint, incredibly serious muttering coming from the living room behind me. I turned my head, peering through the open glass doors. Sterling, the terrifying apex predator CEO of Manhattan, was currently sitting cross-legged on a plush cream rug. He was wearing a soft gray cashmere sweater and sweatpants, a wardrobe choice that would have given his New York board of directors a collective heart attack. In his massive, capable hands, he held a silver tablet. resting perfectly against his broad chest, sound asleep and drooling slightly onto the expensive cashmere, was our 6-month-old son, Leo. "I don't understand," Sterling whispered fiercely to himself, his brow furrowed in absolute analytical concentration. He tapped the screen of his tablet. "If we adjust the feeding window by precisely 14 minutes, the REM sleep cycle should theoretically extend by an additional 12%. The data clearly suggests a correlation, yet the subject aggressively defied the projection at 3 in the morning. I leaned against the door frame, a soft, helpless laugh escaping my lips. "Sterling, you cannot apply machine learning and predictive analytics to a teething alpha infant. He is not a fluctuating stock portfolio." Sterling looked up, his dark eyes instantly softening as they met mine. The heavy, exhausted shadows that used to haunt his face were completely gone. The scent of winter pine in the room wasn't suppressed or icy. It was a warm, steady hum of absolute contentment. "I am merely trying to optimize his recovery parameters," Sterling replied defensively, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He gently patted Leo's back, a gesture so tender and practiced, it made my chest ache in the best possible way. "As a probationary employee in this household, I am dedicated to maximizing my performance metrics." "Your performance metrics are perfectly fine," I said, walking over and pressing a kiss to the crown of his messy hair. "But if you wake him up with your corporate strategizing, I am demoting you to the guest room." "Understood, Mr. CEO," he whispered, leaning his head against my hip. Life had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer the hidden anonymous boss of Onyx Media. I had stepped into the light. The industry now knew exactly who was steering the most aggressive data analytics firm in the country. I still ran my empire primarily from this coastal house, prioritizing my son and my peace of mind over Manhattan's endless rat race. Sterling remarkably had adapted. He hadn't abandoned his own empire, of course. He was still an alpha-driven and ambitious, but his priorities had violently rearranged themselves. He structured his billion-dollar mergers around Leo's nap schedule. He flew back to New York only when absolutely necessary, and even then, he looked like a man holding his breath until he could return to our wooden deck. Later that evening, after Leo was finally put to bed, completely ignoring Sterling's 14-minute optimization strategy, the house grew quiet. I was sitting on the living room sofa, my laptop resting on my knees. The fireplace was crackling softly, casting a warm, flickering glow across the room. I wasn't looking at upcoming client proposals or political data sets. I was looking at the past. I had opened the original YouTube Studio dashboard of Onyx Media's very first channel. The screen displayed the lifetime analytics graph. I traced my finger over the very beginning of the timeline, a completely flat line. The historic, devastating 0 views that had almost broken me. I remembered the tears, the crushing doubt, and the suffocating feeling of being utterly worthless. Then my finger traced the sudden vertical spike the moment I weaponized my grief and turned it into data. The graph never dipped again. It soared into the tens of millions, a digital monument to my survival. The sofa dipped beside me. Sterling settled in, bringing with him the comforting scent of pine and the faint, sweet smell of baby lotion. He didn't ask what I was doing. He simply wrapped his strong arm around my waist and pulled my back securely against his chest, resting his chin on my shoulder to look at the glowing screen. That was the first video. Sterling murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble against my back. "The one you funded with the Centurion card." The very same. I smiled, leaning my head back against him. "You know, my finance department finally cleared the last of that debt yesterday. The seed funding has been officially repaid in full with interest." Sterling's arm tightened around me. He pressed a long, deliberate kiss to the sensitive scent gland on my neck, sending a warm shiver down my spine. "I don't want the money, Elias," he said softly. "I never did." "I know," I replied, lacing my fingers through his large hand resting on my stomach. "But keeping the books balanced is good business." We sat in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. There was no need for suppressants, no need for masks, and no need to pretend we were anything other than exactly what we were, two flawed people who had to break everything to figure out how to build it right. "I was looking at the divorce papers the other day," Sterling said quietly, his thumb gently tracing the platinum ring that had recently quietly found its way back onto my left hand. "My legal team sent over the finalized archive copies. I almost burned them." "You shouldn't," I said, turning my head to look at him. "Those papers are the most valuable documents we own. Sterling frowned, a flicker of old guilt shadowing his eyes. They represent the worst mistake I ever made. The moment I threw you away because I was too blind and too arrogant to understand what love actually required. No, Sterling, I said, softly reaching up to cup his cheek. The stubble on his jaw was rough against my palm. That signature destroyed an arrangement. It killed a forced marriage that was suffocating both of us. If you hadn't signed those papers, I would have spent the rest of my life shrinking myself to fit into your shadow. I would have never taken your card. I would have never built Onyx. And you. I smiled, looking deeply into the dark eyes of the man who had finally learned how to be a true partner. You would have never learned how to kneel. Sterling's breath hitched. He closed his eyes, leaning heavily into my touch. When he opened them again, they were entirely clear, burning with a quiet, infinite devotion. You're right, he whispered, his lips brushing against mine. It was a catastrophic liquidation of assets, but it bought me the only thing in this world that actually matters. And what is that? I asked, a teasing lilt in my voice. You, Sterling murmured, closing the distance between us in a slow, deep, and unconditionally surrendering kiss. The absolute best return on investment of my life. Outside, the Pacific Ocean crashed against the cliffs, relentless and eternal. Inside, surrounded by the warmth of the fire, the hum of the servers, and the quiet breathing of our son in the next room, I finally closed the laptop. The Empire was secure. The Alpha was tamed, and the ex-husband's seed funding had officially yielded the greatest dividend I could have ever calculated, a future that was entirely, unequivocally mine.